Hello, everyone. Santier here, and today I want to talk a little bit about Kirby, specifically Kirby's copy abilities and the way that they have kind of played around with how these work. I've been playing through Kirby in the Forgotten Land. I've gotten the credits roll, and that contrasts pretty strongly with other Kirby games I've played. Kirby 64: The Crystal Shards was my first experience with Kirby. For those who don't know that much about Kirby, just a quick overview. As a character, he is both adorable, and his abilities are sucking in opponents and converting them into some sort of power. Not all enemies have a power, but a lot of them do. So there's a lot of classic Kirby powers. You've got like fire, where Kirby breathes fire. You've got burning, where Kirby turns into a fireball that goes shooting forward. You've got wheel, where Kirby turns into a wheel and rolls around and is pretty indestructible. But is like always moving while in wheel mode. You've got hammer. Some of them have smash, which is a copy of like Kirby's Super Smash Brothers moveset, which is kind of fun. There's like fighting and throw. There's a huge selection of classic Kirby abilities. But there's a couple of Kirby games that have experimented around with how abilities work. And Crystal Shards is one of them, and Forgotten Lands is another. So my experience with Kirby, there's an interesting thing with the anchoring effect, where the first thing that you experience of something is what you think that thing is like. And so for me with Kirby, it was, hey, the Kirby 64 Crystal Shards was the first. I mean, my first experience with Kirby is Smash Brothers, but that's atypical in terms of Kirby games. So my first experience was Crystal Shards, and in that game, Kirby has a very limited selection of powers, but you can combine them. So there's not like there's a fire power, but it makes you do the burning thing where you turn into a fireball and go shooting forward. And then there's like, say, Cutter. Cutter in that game does a very unusual thing of throwing your face forward as a boomerang that goes out and then comes back. If you combine those powers, you can combine combine two powers. If you combine them, you get a burning sword that Kirby just materializes out of his mouth. And so there's this really cool mechanic of combining things. So like there's Spark plus Cutter would make a double-ended lightsaber, which, you know, to somebody who is into the Star Wars prequels was like, that's super cool. So that's a very different way of handling powers that I thought was really cool, and that's just kind of how I knew that they worked. And then I encountered some of the GBA games, Nightmare in Dreamland and Amazing Mirror in particular, that do a more traditional route for doing Kirby's powers. And it's interesting to see them experiment with Kirby's powers yet again in Forgotten Lands, where you have these lines that you kind of expand. And so you start off where, say, fire is kind of a combination of fire and burning. If you're in the air and you're moving while you use it, you will do the burning effect of turning into a fireball. But it starts off as like a basic fire, and then it goes to like a volcano. And then you get a like a dragon version where it's even more powerful. Or you have kind of a shooting power where you can do normal shots and you can charge up charge shots. And that gets increasingly powerful as you go. And so this creates a really interesting effect where normally there's a much broader pool of powers. The Forgotten Lands and 64 Crystal Shards have much narrower base powers, but the total number of powers is actually still quite large. They're just in these families of powers or in these combinatorics. And I think that's a really interesting way to experiment with things, where you're getting like Forgotten Lands, for example, doesn't have Spark, which is a traditional Kirby power. But instead, it's like, okay, some of those effects you can see in some of these other powers. And I think it's an interesting way to sort of experiment, change up sort of the formula with how powers work, and to try out something a little bit different with them. I would really like to see the Kirby 64 thing come back. But I appreciate that they're taking the time and experimenting with the design, seeing, okay, how can we do things a little bit differently? What's a different approach we can take? What's a different way that we can handle this to get a slightly different gameplay effect? And to create a sense of progression in a different sort of way. Because that's one of the things that's really cool about advancing your powers with this, is it's a progression mechanism that works in a bit of a different way. And I think that's kind of a neat thing for them to do as well. So it's just something that I wanted to talk about briefly. I just thought it was really interesting to see how they've experimented with Kirby's powers at various times. Kirby as a franchise has been quite experimental as well in terms of like structure. Amazing Mirror, for example, that I mentioned previously, is more of a Metroidvania. And that sort of thing I think is really neat. I appreciate that they experiment with how Kirby is structured. So anyway, just something I wanted to talk about briefly. Hope you all are doing well. And until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.